how very much I've loved you, how very much I've tried my best to give you a good life.
There was no excommunication. Like, once Jim had you, he did not want you to go.
No, you're not going. You're not going. You're not going.
You know, there's no question about it that I was brainwashed. Jim didn't tell people what was going on. It was all lies.
The choice is not ours now. It's out of our hands. Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired.
First they said there were 300 people, and they said, no, there's 600 bodies. Finally they said, everybody is dead.
No more pain, I said, Al. No more pain.
It wasn't suicide. It was murder.
Hello and welcome again to Cults and Conspiracies, our live exploration into the who, what, where, and why regarding cult groups. We'll hear real testimonies, raw and unfiltered, as we attempt to glean context into the process involved in joining, living in, and escaping cults. Charles Manson, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Shoko Asahara. These names live forever in infamy, but are these horrible cult leaders total outliers? Is their charisma and power of attraction truly uncommon, or could there be more like them, waiting in the weeds? The extent to which the cult members can be affected by such leaders is vast, but to gain some perspective, we put together a video highlighting two better-known cults.
Hello? Yes, I need to report an anonymous tip. Who do I talk to?
This is regarding what?
This is regarding a mass suicide.
On March 26, 1997, police discovered the decomposing bodies of 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult in an upscale mansion in San Diego, California. The strange religion was led by Marshall Doe Applewhite, a music teacher turned messiah.
I'll tell you about a kingdom level beyond here, and if you want to go there, then you have to follow me because I'm the guy who's got the key at the moment.
He preached that a UFO trailing the Hale-Bopp comet was waiting to take their souls to a better extraterrestrial world, but only if they committed ceremonial suicide.
I'm very proud of these students of the Kingdom of Heaven. They're about to leave, and they're excited about leaving.
And some people would say that Doe was suffering from a great mental illness.
Yes, a great many people said that Jesus was suffering from a great mental illness, I'm sure.
Good evening. It happened outside Waco, Texas. A heavily armed compound, a religious cult, their leader claiming to be Jesus Christ.
On April 19, 1993, after a violent 51-day standoff with the FBI at the Mount Carmel compound in Waco, Texas, a fire erupted and consumed over 80 members of the Branch Davidians cult, including 22 children and David Koresh, their psychopathic leader.
He is strongly delusionary, very paranoid, probably sociopathic.
Do you believe that Koresh was the Messiah?
I think he was a Messiah.
Koresh believed himself to be the spiritual descendant of King David, and though accused of child abuse, statutory misconduct, polygamy, and stockpiling weapons, he commanded complete loyalty from his followers, to the bitter end.
If you don't follow the truth, you're going to hell!
Two different cults. Two different leaders. One similarly devastating result.
Wow. Dr. Janja Lalich is an author, Dr. Janja Lalich is an author and researcher focused on cult groups specializing in charismatic authority, ideology, and social control. She is currently a professor of sociology at California State University, Chico. Janja, thank you for joining me, and I apologize for messing up your name.
All
I won't do it again. I've got
right.
it this time.
That's all right. Everybody does it.
No, it's okay because, I want to give you special reverence because you are clearly one of the most quoted and the most revered authorities in the field from my research. So,
thank you.
Since you are so commonly referenced, And since you are such a big deal in the world of studying cults, I would like to know how you define a cult.
Okay. Well, a cult can be either a group or a social movement, and the way I look at it, there have to be 4 requirements. First is the charismatic leader, and that person can be alive or dead. They all eventually die. But others may carry on the tradition. Secondly is what I call the transcendent belief system, which is a belief system that basically offers you the answer to everything, right? The past, the present, the future. And the important part about the transcendent belief system, because most religions, many ideological groups will offer you that kind of understanding of the world or a framework for the world. But what's different in cults is they have what I call a recipe for change, which is that they will tell you exactly how you need to transform yourself in order to be on the path to salvation or whatever it is they're offering you, right? So they give you explicit instructions on how to go through that transformation, which is different from, say, a mainstream religion, which might say to you, be good to your neighbors. But nobody's telling you exactly how to be good to your neighbors, or they don't check up on you every day if you're being good to your neighbors, right? So it's different. Yeah. And then third and fourth are what I call systems of influence and systems of control. So the control mechanisms are the more obvious rules, regulations, the things you know you have to do or not do. And the systems of influence are the more subtle pressures on you to keep conforming and keep abiding by the rules of the group. So that includes like peer pressure, guilting, shaming, some form of criticism, etc. So those 4 characteristics for me is what I look at when I'm trying to identify something as a cult.
Interesting. So those are the categories there. Now, do you think that our culture, or that there's something about our world, our modern society, that particularly breeds the personalities of these cult leaders?
No, I mean, certainly not just our culture in America. I mean, cults exist all over the world, and cults have existed since time immemorial.
Right.
So it's nothing specific about our culture. I think it's that there are always going to be con artists. There are always going to be people who want to take advantage of other people. There are always going to be people who perhaps had some kind of mystical episode and believe they're a prophet or something. And so I don't think it's anything specific to our culture. It's a human phenomenon.
And so it's not necessarily a societal thing. It just has to do with the human nature, as it were, in your estimation.
Yeah. There's good people and bad people.
That's right. That's right. But some, like these cult leaders, they're a special breed, and many of them, I would say, twist religion to their benefit, using ancient religions going back, and normal, monotheistic religion as well. And they proclaim themselves messiahs and saviors and things of that attitude. Now, do you think there's any kind of particular mental illness or mental instability that would be specifically associated with this kind of belief?
Well, again, it's going to depend. I mean, every cult leader, even though there are many similarities among them and personality traits that you can identify kind of across the spectrum, but the ones who declare themselves some type of religious leader or religious prophet, they either are someone who had a psychotic break and believed some angel came down and spoke to them, or believed, they looked at these stones and they were written from God, or whatever it might be, right? And then they decide, they've just discovered a new religion and they're going to get people to follow them. So some of those people might start out actually with good intentions. They were fooled by their own, whatever. Other people just start out as straight out charlatans. They will use religion because religion is such a common thing for people to flock to. And they will use the ancient and traditional religions because it puts them in a lineage that gives them credibility, right? And it's something that people are familiar with, right? So if it has the trappings of Christianity, it's not going to seem so unusual to the recruits that are coming in, right? Like it's not some weird thing.
Right.
So there are going to be a variety of reasons they take that path. In terms of mental illness, I mean, my feeling is most cult leaders are some form of sociopath, whether they've been diagnosed that way or not, and most of them we can't really ever diagnose because we can't get our hands on them to put them through psychological tests, right? But most of them are sociopaths or psychopaths, whatever you want to call it, to some degree. And then some of them over time become straight out crazy. I mean, if you take someone like Jim Jones, who, because of the drugs and, his brain was completely addled, by then, yes, you could say he was mentally ill. But the illness, if you want to call it that, the illness that they have is a type of narcissism and megalomania, which is what gets them to want to be this leader.
In the first place, to have that power.
Right.
You mentioned something interesting that I just wanted to touch on briefly. The idea of people twisting around ancient religions or religions that are more familiar to your average person. Would you say that type of cult is more dangerous and insidious than one that comes up with their own sort of wild belief system?
Not necessarily. And first of all, I want to make the point that not all cults are religious.
Right,
that's true. There are all types of
political
cults.
And otherwise.
Yeah, political, UFO, therapy, self-help, lose weight, whatever it is. There can be every kind of cult. Most people think of cult, when they think of cult, they think of religion, but it doesn't have to be that. I mean, it's not about the belief system so much as the structure that's set up to influence people and get them to conform and get them to follow orders. But I think when it comes to when a cult's going to be more violent or not, has really more to do with the proclivities of the leader than the actual belief system. The belief system will be used to justify that behavior, but it's really what's in the leader's head or what's in their background. And we might want to talk more about that.
We will definitely get to that.
Yeah.
But basically, you're saying that the level of violence or danger involved has more to do with the leader himself than the actual precepts of the cult. Interesting. Okay, that's an interesting distinction to make. But I want to take this back to you personally, because I'm wondering how you became involved in this line of work, and whether you have any kind of personal history with this.
And I do.
Well, that's a trick of the trade. But let's take it back and pretend that I don't.
Right, pretend that you don't. Yes. So I was in a cult myself back in the 70s and 80s, and I was in my 30s when I joined, so I had already gone to college. I had a degree. I had been a Fulbright scholar. I was always a smart kid. Nobody ever pushed me around.
Right.
And suddenly I got into this cult. It was a political cult, and it had to do with the times. It was the 70s, and I was new in San Francisco. It was a way to meet friends, I thought. And so I was in that group for about 10 and a half years. And when I got out, I left the Bay Area and moved to New York. I was 41, and I would say that my brain was fried. I was not a person I knew before.
Really?
And I couldn't figure out what had happened to me, how I had become that person who I was in the cult, because I was a very harsh person. I was a leader. I was in the inner circle almost the entire time. And so I did bad, mean things to people. And so I started reading. I didn't know what to do. I started reading because that was always my thing when I was a kid. And and everything I read was about religious cults. So I was like, well, I guess I wasn't in a cult. It wasn't a religious cult, right? So it took me a long time. It took me months to kind of figure that out. And then I finally read a book by the psychiatrist Robert Lifton, who wrote about brainwashing in China. And it was a political context, so it made sense to me. I was like, oh my God, that is what happened to me.
Like Maoism? Is that?
Yes,
oh, I see.
yeah. What they call their thought reform program. And so then I, got into therapy. I started studying and reading and going to conferences and it kind of became, initially I was doing it for recovery, and then I was doing it to just help educate and try to keep other people from making the mistakes that I made. And so then I, wrote some books. I went back to school and got my graduate degree, which took 10 years for me to even make that decision.
Really?
It's hard to explain how difficult it is when you get out of one of those groups, because you're like a shrunken person.
Right.
So,
if you don't mind me asking, can you tell me a little bit of the background of the particular group that you were involved with?
Yeah, sure. It was a left wing. It was Marxist-Leninist, and it was in San Francisco in the mid-70s, about 74. And there were a lot of different groups around at that time, tiny little communist sects, basically, who were trying to recruit people. And it was, as I said earlier, it was after the Vietnam War ended. So most of the people on the left were trying to figure out what to do with themselves. Like, what should our next project be? What should we do next? And so these little groups were recruiting. Through friends of friends, I ran into some people who recruited me, and I was attracted to that particular group because it was founded and led by women. And the idea was that we were going to combat sexism and racism and classism, and it was different from the other left groups at the time, even the more mainstream left groups like the Democratic Socialists or whoever was around at the time. I remember when I was in New York, before that, I went to do some political work. This was during the war. I went to a political group's office in New York, and my friend and I walked in, and they said, "Oh, good, the girls are here. Can you make us some coffee?"
Oh, great. Right? Very progressive.
And that's what it was like back then. It was very sexist, and women weren't given responsibility. So the fact that this group was founded and led by women, even though it had both men and women in it, pretty much of equal proportions, that was a draw for me and for a lot of other people at that time. So our idea, we had a female leader who most people didn't know was a severe alcoholic and completely cuckoo, if I might say.
Right.
And but the idea was that we were working toward the revolution, and we believed that the revolution wouldn't happen in our lifetime, but that we were laying the groundwork for it. So we were martyrs for the revolution, right? So we saw ourselves as martyrs, and of course martyrs are supposed to suffer. So of course you were miserable. I mean, the word happy wasn't in our vocabulary.
Right.
And we worked 18-hour days, 20-hour days, every day of the week, very few days off, year after year after year. And it got quite abusive because we spent a great deal of time sitting in circles and criticizing somebody, which came from Mao, which is something that Mao introduced to Marxism-Leninism, was this form of criticism, self-criticism. And so people were just torn down, torn apart. Meanwhile, we did, there are some good things we did. We fought against Proposition 13, which passed in California back then, and we put other propositions on the ballot. We ran people for office. But a lot of that we did so we could take over, like we tried to take over the Peace and Freedom Party, which was a third party. And all of it was for the glory of the leader. And as time went on, more and more of our projects had nothing to do with working class struggles, which is, we were supposed to be this working class party, right? So there got to be this big disconnect between what the leader wanted and what everybody thought we were doing.
Right.
And that sort of led to a blowout at the end, and we actually expelled our leader and dissolved the organization, which doesn't happen very often. I can only know one other group that happened to. So we finally had our revolution. We threw out our leader.
That speaks to the power you guys had. Now, if you're just joining us, I want to remind everyone that you are currently watching Cults and Conspiracies live on Super News. I am with my tremendous host, I'm going to get it right this time, Dr. Yanya Lalich, who is an author and researcher focused on cult groups, specializing in charismatic authority, ideology, and social control. She is currently professor of sociology at California State University, Chico. We are going to reiterate everyone with another clip getting into today's topic, which has to do with escaping cults. So let's check that out, and we'll come back and discuss it further.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life.
There was no excommunication. Like, once Jim had you, he did not want you to go.
No, you're not going. You're not going. You're not going.
There's no question about it that I was brainwashed. Jim didn't tell people what was going on. It was all lies.
The choice is not ours now. It's out of our hands. Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired.
First they said there were 300 people, and they said, no, there's 600 bodies. Finally they said, everybody is dead.
No more pain, I said, Al. No more pain.
It wasn't suicide. It was murder.
Hello and welcome again to Cults and Conspiracies, our live exploration into the who, what, where, and why regarding cult groups. We'll hear real testimonies, raw and unfiltered, as we attempt to glean context into the process. Welcome back. What an incredible clip. I'd like to thank you again for joining us and get right back into the questions, Dr. Lalich. So, have you ever directly dealt with a cult leader in your practice? And if so, what was that experience like?
Not really directly. I mean, I only directly dealt with my own cult leader when I was in the cult. I've been close to some cult leaders when I've been an expert witness in some trials. So I've sat across from them and had them glaring at me. But no, they, you know, most cult leaders stay pretty sequestered and they don't make themselves very available to people. And I'm probably the last person they would make themselves available to,
right?
Given my reputation. So no, I haven't had that kind of direct contact. I've certainly observed many of them either on videos or films or, you know, in audiences, whatever.
That's interesting, but you haven't had a sort of a face-to-face sit-down with any of them. Of course, they wouldn't want to discuss this sort of thing. You would be their enemy, right. Kind of a rival of sorts. Okay, so do you think on that note that many of these cult leaders actually buy into their beliefs, or is it really more something that they're using as a means to an end in a way?
Well, that's a question I get a lot. I think a small proportion of them start out with good intentions. They may be starting a little non-denominational church on the corner. They may have had some kind of mystical experience and start teaching yoga or whatever, right? Become some kind of guru. But even in those cases, the kind of adulation and power that the adulation that they expect and the power that they get, most people can't handle that kind of power, right? It's that old saying, you know, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
So that's why many of these small non-denominational churches, which is now a common place where you might find a cult in our country, is because there are so many of these corners, you know, street corner churches that just open up in a little, or they run out of somebody's house. And they can become, I'm not saying they're all like that, but they can become very cultic because they are non-denominational, which means they're not part of a larger denomination which will hold checks and balances on them, right? They have nobody they have to report to. It's just them and their flock, all right? So, so they may start out believing their own story. I'd say that's probably 10%. And I'm probably being generous.
Right.
I would say most of them, I'm sorry to say, are just straight out con artists.
Really?
And they find something that works, and they may believe on some level they have some special powers. I mean, they may be deluded in that way. And I suppose on some level they have to believe their own story. And you know, there's a thing about charismatic leaders is, and I think some people don't quite understand how charisma works, but charisma is a relationship. It's a social relationship, right? Somebody's not charismatic unless they have followers, right? So if it's just a guy standing on a soapbox on a corner and nobody's paying attention to him, well, he's not charismatic, right? So the charismatic leader has the obligation to keep his followers hyped up about him. So he has to keep doing whatever his magic tricks are, or making golden auras, or you know, whatever he says he can do, you know, or being mysterious or being erratic or whatever it might be. So he or she has to keep doing that in order to keep the flock titillated, basically, right? And so they do have that obligation. So on some level you might think, okay, they might believe their own story because it makes them a better actor when they have to, you know, pretend they're channeling some 40-million-year-old being. You know, but I do think most of them know it's a con. Most of them are just taking advantage. They're doing it out of for money, power, or sex. You know, one of those three, or maybe all three, or two of the three. That's usually what motivates them. And you know, it's going to vary. Some cult leaders are happy with just 100 people or 15 people. Whereas then you'll have some cult leaders, you know, like Reverend Moon or other leaders who have thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Like the cult I was in, she never wanted it to get too big because she couldn't handle it. So if it ever got too big, she'd say, get rid of those people, and then we'd have a purge and we'd get rid of people.
Get rid of them.
Right. So it all depends, again, on the proclivities and desires and what that leader thinks he can pull together.
So it's all based around the leadership from the top down.
Yeah, absolutely.
That shows the power that they have. Now, on the topic of the Heaven's Gate cult in particular and their mass suicide, you've written specifically about a bounded choice theory as a sort of case study for that cult. Now, can you explain a little bit about that theory and how it applies to those cults and their leaders?
Sure. So as I explained earlier in my definition, we have these like 4 aspects of a cult: the charismatic authority, the transcendent belief system, systems of control, and systems of influence. Once you are drawn into that and you are going through the indoctrination process, right, which is ongoing. It's not like one day, boom, you're brainwashed and then you're not, you're not who you were before.
Right.
Right. The indoctrination process is ongoing and has to continually be reinforced.
Right.
So cult leaders or their lieutenants will put you through tests, or when call up your mother and say you hate her, because they know that's what's really going to get you. And if you don't do it, then they don't care. They get rid of you. Right. So they put you through tests, and every time you go through these tests, you recommit. Right, and you're in deeper and deeper and deeper. So after time, especially if the cult is sequestered, like living on a compound somewhere, but even if it's not, you've entered what I call a bounded reality, right? You're in the reality of the cult leader's world, right? And nothing else really matters to you. You're not allowed to have anything else matter to you. Right? Nothing else is true, only what that person says is true. So even though you might be living in San Francisco, you might be going to, excuse me, you might be going to work every day, whatever, you're in this other world.
Right.
Right?
Permanently.
So I call that a bounded reality. Once you're in that world to a degree where you believe that there can be no life outside the cult. You cannot imagine life outside the cult. So then when decisions are come to you, when you have to make a decision about something, which you don't really get to make a lot of decisions when you're in a cult, but you get to make some. And sometimes they're more weighty than others. You know what choice you have to make to stay in the good graces of the group. So that's what I call, you're then in this state of bounded choice. It's not that you don't have free will, because there's a whole debate about free will. It's not that someone's holding a gun to your head, which does happen, but mostly not, right? No one's holding a gun to your head and say, go rob that store because we need money for our cult, or go whatever, go sleep with that child, whatever, right? Nobody's doing that. But you're so enmeshed and you have so internalized the beliefs and the rules and the norms of the group that you know what choice you have to make. So in a sense, it's an altered free will. It's free will that is dominated by the will of the leader. And so that's what I call bounded choice.
I see. It's a fascinating theory. It definitely rings true based on everything you
and then that's
discussed.
what leads people to commit mass suicide.
Right.
Because how can you not? When you've in that case of Heaven's Gate, they all did that video beforehand, right? Where 2 or 3 of them sat in front of the video and said goodbye.
Right. Very eerie.
Right. And they did that with everyone else sitting around them. Well, once you've made a public statement, this is why public confession and public statements and that kind of public commitment, making a public commitment, is so important in cults, because once you've made that kind of public statement in front of your peers, in front of people who you consider your family, what are you going to do? Then stand up and say, oh, guys, I was just kidding. I'm not going to drink the poison,
No, not likely.
Yeah, you're not likely.
Yeah.
So the peer pressure actually has, in some cases, even more influence than the leader. The leader kind of sets it off, and then everybody locks in.
I see, based on that.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So there's no direct intimidation is not necessarily part of the fact, of those factors.
No, it's quite subtle. It's quite subtle. It can be quite subtle, which is why people don't recognize it.
Right. It's insidious in a way, yes. Now, based off of that train of thought, is there a special subsect of cult leaders that you think would be more willing to incite sort of mass violence, such as like Marshall Applewhite or Jim Jones, that type of person? Or do you believe that theoretically anyone who's willing to create a cult or has that sort of mind frame could also be capable of violent acts like that?
No, I think the road to violence, again, is going to depend very much on the leader and who the leader is. So it's going to depend on whether that leader had any kind of criminal background, whether that leader is a pathological liar and has just basically made everything up, whether that leader has extreme delusions of grandeur. I mean, all of them have some level of delusions of grandeur, or they wouldn't be a cult leader, but when it gets to extremes, it depends on the level of being sequestered, and it depends on the how should I describe it? It depends on the super dedication of the inner circle around the leader. If you have completely 100% yes men, and nobody is ever trying to bring some sense to the leader, well, that's going to take that person more to extremes. If there's a history of drugs or alcohol, so if you take someone like Jim Jones, I'm sure in the early days when Jones first started his church, even though he was a psychopath, there were incidents in his childhood that were evidence of that. But even in the beginning, he was kind of a liberal pastor who was looking for peace and against racism, whatever. But as he got more and more followers, as he got more taken with himself, and as he got more addled with drugs, until he was psychotic in the end, clearly, that's when violence can happen, you know. Or if they're on a compound and the level of paranoia of the leader is so great, you know, nobody can leave the compound, the helicopters are coming, the authorities are coming, whatever, that can potentially lead to violence. So not every cult is going to go that route, no. And then there are also external factors. I mean, if there are a lot of media exposés, and the cult leader gets again very paranoid or very, you know, feeling disarmed or whatever, that can lead. I mean, if you can take Waco as an example, right? I mean, they were buying arms before that, and there was minor violence within the cult before that. But once they got raided, there was nowhere he was going to turn. You know, he was going to blow.
David Koresh.
Right. Yeah, he was going to blow. But the setting was already there because he had preached about it. You know, they're going to come get us. We need arms. They're going to, you know. So the seeds were there.
Yeah. Even in Jonestown, you have that with Congressman Leo Ryan coming and sort of external pressure.
Right. But he had, you know, but Jones had been doing those white night drills long before that.
Yes,
right?
It's true. The sort of mock mass suicides in preparation.
Yeah. Are you gonna drink the poison? Right.
Right. And
would you kill for me? Would you kill for me?
The answer was yes.
Yeah.
Tragically.
Yeah.
If you are just joining us, I want to remind everyone that you are currently watching Cults and Conspiracies live on Super News. I'm here with a wonderful guest, Dr. Janja Lalich, an author and researcher focused on cult groups, specializing in charismatic authority, ideology, and social control. Now, to get everyone up to speed, we're going to play a little video clip again about the topic of the day, which has to do with cult leaders and the strong leadership involved in these groups. After that, we'll get right back into our discussion.
Hello? Yes, I need to report an anonymous tip. Who do I talk to?
This is regarding what?
This is regarding a mass suicide.
On March 26, 1997, police discovered the decomposing bodies of 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult in an upscale mansion in San Diego, California. The strange religion was led by Marshall Doe Applewhite, a music teacher turned messiah.
I'll tell you about a kingdom level beyond here, and if you want to go there, then you have to follow me because I'm the guy who's got the key at the moment.
He preached that a UFO trailing the Hale-Bopp comet was waiting to take their souls to a better extraterrestrial world, but only if they committed ceremonial suicide.
I'm very proud of these students of the Kingdom of Heaven. They're about to leave, and they're excited about leaving.
And some people would say that Doe was suffering from a great mental illness.
Yes, a great many people said that Jesus was suffering from a great mental illness, I'm sure.
Good evening. It happened outside Waco, Texas. A heavily armed compound, a religious cult, their leader claiming to be Jesus Christ.
On April 19, 1993, after a violent 51-day standoff with the FBI at the Mount Carmel compound in Waco, Texas, a fire erupted and consumed over 80 members of the Branch Davidians cult, including 22 children and David Koresh, their psychopathic leader.
He is strongly delusionary, very paranoid, probably sociopathic.
Do you believe that Koresh was the Messiah?
I think he was a Messiah.
Koresh believed himself to be the spiritual descendant of King David, and though accused of child abuse, statutory misconduct, polygamy, and stockpiling weapons, he commanded complete loyalty from his followers to the bitter end.
If you don't follow the truth, you're going to hell!
2 different cults. 2 different leaders. 1 similarly devastating result.
I'm Aaron Paul from The Path, and you're watching Cults and Conspiracies.
Wow, it's a really powerful clip. So Dr. Lalich, continuing on with our stream of thought, I'm wondering about whether modern cult leaders, ones in the more contemporary vein, might study up on the tactics of other older leaders like the Jim Jones, Mansons of the world, etc., as sort of an inspiration or a blueprint. Have you ever heard of something like that?
Well, it's interesting because in my book, Take Back Your Life, we talk about that all cult leaders go to the cookie cutter Messiah school because they're all, they're all so similar. The patterns just jump out at you. I think some of them do learn from others. Ones that have worked. Certainly, the ones that are offshoots of another group. For example, a lot of the New Age training programs, a lot of those leaders of a particular group now went through one of those training programs and was maybe a staff person and then broke off and started his own. So he learned the gimmicks, as a member himself. But I think what people don't often understand is that what happens in cults is that the leaders, and mostly their lieutenants, because the leaders aren't often around, what they're doing is using just straightforward social psychology, right? They're using influence techniques that we have grown up with, that we're familiar with, that we respond to like that. So, they're using love, they're using guilt, they're using shame, they're using fear, they're using peer pressure, right? There's nothing unusual, right? It's not that they come up with some, special way of doing things. They're just doing things. They know how to turn the screws on people. They're good manipulators, but they're not doing anything special, really, anything out of the ordinary. And that's, again, why people respond, why they don't think there's maybe anything wrong right away or maybe never. So they have to be good manipulators. They have to be domineering personalities, right, and authoritarian personalities. But it's not like they go to the library and say, how did so-and-so do it? And now some of them might. I mean, actually, my cult leader, I actually worked at a bookstore, and we had another member who worked at a library, and our job was to get her books on other leaders, on various ways that people were changed. And she actually did her dissertation on resocialization programs, right? So, she had, in a sense, studied it, but I think that's atypical. So I think they do trial and error. They do what works and what doesn't work, And in so many cases, in far too many cases, they use sex as a way to manipulate. And when you're manipulating someone sexually, that's one of the deepest ways you're going to affect someone or touch someone, right?
Yeah.
So if you're controlled sexually, either because the leader's having sex with you, or he's telling you what positions you and your mate should use, or he's telling you how many children to have or how to raise your child, all these things that are very intimate in your life, that goes very deep. And so they're just doing these ordinary things. There's nothing unusual about what they're doing. It's just that it's packaged in a way that's so strong. And it's around you every day. It's around you all the time, and you're not having any other input. So in our normal life, right, we have friends. Some of them might be liberal, some of them might be conservative, or in our families at least, right? We might have liberals and conservatives.
Yes.
We live in a neighborhood. We have friends who have, different kinds of beliefs, different kind of parents, go to different kind of churches, right, when we're young. We have how many TV programs we can watch. We've got music of all kind that have different influences. So we have all these places we can go in our life to get different points of view, right? So if we're questioning, I don't know about this guy I'm dating. He seems a little clawy. So you'll have drinks with your girlfriends and say, well, let me tell you what he does. What do you think, right? And you'll get feedback, right? There's all these ways we can get feedback in our lives normally. That doesn't happen in a cult. The only feedback you get is the party line.
Right.
So there's nowhere else to go, right? So that clamps it down even further. So again, they just see what works, and they have that manipulative personality, and which comes, I think, with being a narcissist.
Yeah.
And that's how it goes.
Right. Well, it speaks sort of to the human condition thing that you brought up earlier. This almost biological, or Darwinian sense of it.
It's a human phenomena. I mean, people always say, "Oh, it's only weak people who get in cults, or it's only people who want to be led around by the nose." That is not true. We are human animals. We are social animals. We either want a family or we want a social group. We want to belong. Most of us. I mean, there's a loner here and there, but most of us want to have that around us, right? And so it's not that only seekers end up in cults. In a sense, we're all seekers, right? And especially today, when the world is so much more complex, people need a framework to understand, right? So they're looking for a way to understand what the heck is going on in this world, right? So that's when cults can come in and recruit. There's that opening, right? People are looking for something. That's why when Eastern Europe fell apart, when the wall came down, and when the Soviet Union broke up, the cults recruited like crazy in those countries because people were open and they had lost their framework and they needed something new to believe in, and they needed a foundation for their lives. Boom, walk the cults, yeah.
And that's not something that's going to go away, those gaps.
No.
They'll always happen, of course.
They'll always happen.
So on that topic of these methods that are employed, what, in your mind, are some of the most commonly implemented tools of brainwashing, as it were, or control used by these cult leaders?
Well, I don't like to use the word brainwashing because it's so controversial,
Right.
although I do believe brainwashing exists.
You do believe that.
I was brainwashed.
Right.
I can vouch for that. And I was one of the brainwashers in my organization. So
there are some that would dispute brainwashing.
Yes, absolutely, and they're wrong. And probably all the other people you've had on your show will tell you the same thing.
Yeah, you're completely right. Our first guest, who was in the People's Temple, admitted freely that she had been brainwashed.
Yeah, no,
so.
I can give you some of the examples of why I believe that, but I'm not going to. But in the interest of time, I think the most common things are to separate people from their normal environment and their normal social circle. Now, that might not happen right away, but it'll happen over time, where you'll break away from people who aren't in the group. Or in some cases, you might be ordered to, write a disconnect letter to your family or whatever. But over time, you'll be separated from your normal world. There will be some kind of instructional classes, they can call it whatever they want, that helps the indoctrination process. It's basically a resocialization that's going on, right? So the thing they want to do is get you to stop thinking and get you to stop relying on your own judgment, right? So to get you to stop thinking, they're going to use certain practices that we call mind numbing or mind stopping. So, and that'll vary with the group. It could be speaking in tongues. It could be meditation. It could be yoga. It could be singing. It could be just working you to death. Working you so hard that, and I mean, that was the case in my group. I mean, we were so tired. You can't think. I mean, if you had questions in the beginning, you can't even remember what those questions were. You're just bloody tired, right? So working you that way. Some cults will use special diets and things like that. That's pretty rare. Very, very, very few cults will use drugs. I mean, Manson did, and Shoko Asahara, the cult leader in Japan, did. But most cults don't need to use drugs. So they'll use these mind-stopping techniques and public testimonials is a way, as I was explaining earlier, when you say something in front of other people, then you're going to follow along with it, right? So that gets you to change. And some form of criticism. Most groups will have some way that you're called on the carpet for something or other. Usually it's publicly. You're going to be, shamed in front of everybody. You're going to be ostracized, whatever. And so I'd say those are the main things that happen.
And all very powerful techniques,
right,
to be sure. Now, we are coming to our final question, sadly, but it's a doozy, so we'll see. It might take some time, maybe not. The question is there a way, in your mind, to combat the phenomenon of cults, to fight back against this phenomenon, or is it simply an unfortunate inevitability?
Well, I do believe there will always be cults of small or large size, of greater or lesser influence. But I think we can certainly do more education. I think if we educate in the schools at a young age, which is very difficult to do, like even for someone like me, to get to go in a school, not at university level, but at the lower grades, it's almost impossible because they think you're going to talk about religion and that you're going to offend somebody. And I always say, I can talk for days without mentioning religion. Let me come in and tell them about, these techniques or these, people that are out there. So I think education helps, making the public more aware, letting people know the ways they can check something out, like how to be a good consumer. You don't just buy the first car you see. You might look in consumers' reports. You test drive this one, test drive that one. People don't do that with cults, and they can today. They can look on the internet. There's so much information now, former member websites, things like that. So the more we can do shows like this, which are educating people that this phenomena exists, and in many cases it's dangerous, so that people aren't running away from this idea, or they're not saying, oh, well, that'll never happen to me, because it pretty much can happen to anybody. So I think education is key, and whether we'll ever really be able to do that on any grand scale, I don't have too much hope for that. So that's why I do what I do, whatever little bit I can do to educate. I think that's all we can do. But I think cults will always be there.
Right. Well, that's an unfortunate reality, but it does seem like you've done more than your part in combating these cults, so we all appreciate that.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our wonderful guest, Jan Jelalich. Next week, we will be joined by a former member of the infamous Children of God sect to discuss the dramatic process involved in escaping the clutches of a cult. What does it take to get back your life after joining such a group? Also, if you've enjoyed today's discussion on cults and conspiracies, I strongly, strongly recommend that you check out Hulu's new series, The Path, streaming now. And I have been Dash Finley, your host. Until next week, thank you all very much for watching.
Thank you for having me.
My name is Eddie, and I was in a cult.
You have the light to shape the world around you.
Was it emotional to see Eddie
come back home?
There was a man following us.
I could turn you in.
You won't, because then it's over. There's not a single thing that you can do to get me to walk away.